My apologies, we're getting started a little late. Life happened, as it sometimes does. Wander back and forth. Tonight we're painting Clayton. He's the villain from Disney's animated feature Tarzan. And he'll be the third in my villain series. I did red for Captain Hook, and orange for Gaston, and now I'm doing yellow for Clayton. And as always, we're going to start by filling in some background. In this, I think I'm going to stick with the colors that are in the reference image. That's sort of like olive drab. But I'm going to put maybe a little more yellow into it to focus on the bamboo. So I'm going to go with yellow ochre on my palette. And I'm going to mix in a little light green. We still want it mostly yellow for the look we're going for. So definitely if you wind up with too much green, as I just have, go back in and add a little more of your yellow. But I'm going to go ahead and just swipe this in real quick because I kind of want to blend it in to be soft. And we're going to do the top real quick. If you're a member of Patreon, I had a traceable up for Clayton, so that way you can just kind of copy him onto your canvas. Definitely makes it easier to paint without having to learn how to draw. And go ahead and put in some more of my yellow. And for this, I'm going to try and stick with mostly up and down motions because I want that kind of like feeling of greenery and forest behind me. Well, behind Clayton. I was reading some facts earlier today, and did you know there's been almost 50 live action Tarzan films? That is insane. And then the author of Tarzan always saw this as being like an animated feature. So even when this was written in like 1913, they always intended for it to be an animated feature. And it took until 1995 for them to get the rights to do it. Or the rights for Disney to do it. Excuse me. Be more specific. And I'm going to do my sides. And I'm going to use my angle brush to keep going around like the shape of him. I absolutely love the film Tarzan. Like, it made me so sad that my niece does not seem to like the music from this soundtrack. Although maybe she does now, but she definitely didn't when she was younger. And I'm just working a little bit of yellow back in because it's a little more green than I wanted. And what I might do is when it's dry, I might go back in and do a thin layer of yellow over it. Just because yellow is super opaque, it would definitely cover and do some interesting effects over top of all of this. And I'm just going to kind of fix my brush strokes here a little bit and work in a little more yellow. And I think I'm going to put in a little bit of cad yellow deep hue. To get a little more of what the color I'm really looking for. And it's okay if you cover up your lines, your working lines a little bit. You can, when we go in to add those, you can always kind of cover where you've already gone. Not a big deal. Easy correction. And add a little bit of yellow on the sides. And on the top. And I think I'm kind of done filling in the background part for now. I'll go back in and add a little more yellow later, but I think that's good for the moment. So I'm going to rinse off my brush. And remove the excess water. Right, next I'm going to go ahead and fill in the yellow of his coat. His yellow is sort of like a yellowy orange, so I'm going to use the Cad Medium Yellow again for that. And since we're going over white, you shouldn't need a whole lot. And you definitely don't need to overthink about how you're putting your brush strokes in for this, because we're going to do a whole lot of texture work here. So for now, you're just coloring in the space. And don't forget that, continuing your art on the side of the canvas, not just the front. So make sure that when you drew, you're extending your line off the side. And then this part on his shirt is yellow. So we're going to do this spot here too. And make sure you get your sides. Okay. And continuing in to fill in the space. Now I'm going to turn it upside down so I can get the bottom side of my canvas. Very good. All right, and the next spot I'm going to do is the shirt over here. We're not touching this spot because this is sort of like his red cummerbund kind of thing, his ascot. And I'm going to go ahead and paint over my line here, just because that for me that's more of a line for later when I'm adding in my details. Just show that that's sort of like a crease in the shirt. I'm going to do my bottom first, so that way when I turn my canvas right side up, it's had a little more time to dry. And don't forget the sides. I absolutely love sort of the ending for this villain. Of all of the villains, we'll go with story exits. His is sort of the darkest and most grim. The very fact that he sort of like falls from a tree and winds up incidentally hanging himself on vines is sort of a very unique Disney death, because most of the time you don't kind of get as much story with it. Like, it's a lot of times they've fallen off a cliff or something along those lines, not so much, well, not so gruesome, but you know, kind of earned it as far as villains go. He's definitely a villain I love to hate, and I think he's sort of underrated in that respect, in that he's a really good villain. Like, he does a good job making you hate his guts. Who is a villain you love to hate? Everyone's got a villain that they love to hate. Is it Cruella? Is it Scar? You know, I already did my Lady Disney villains, but I think I'm gonna go back at some point and do like a bonus for Maleficent in her dragon form. Because I know Dragon Appreciation Day was on Sunday, and I really considered doing an alternative painting for her, just because she is such an amazing villain. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and rinse off my brush, because for the moment I'm done with the yellow. And I'm gonna flip my canvas back over, being careful not to touch the wet areas. And I'm going to go ahead and work in his hair next. And his hair is kind of a burnt umber, but there definitely is some gray in there. So I'm going to go ahead and put my burnt umber in first. And I might work a little bit of white in there for some color value. We'll see. Or I might just mix gray directly in. I haven't altogether decided. And for this, I'm going to use my 4 round detail brush, just because I want a little more control over where it's going, because I want to clean up the line from where I put in my background. And hair is sort of textural, so you'll kind of want to make sure that your brush strokes are always coming like away from the head, because that's the way that hair grows. So it makes sense for a brush stroke to go that way. And if you're like me and you're always putting your hands in your paint, it might be a good idea to dry your canvas rather than keep going, but I'm going to risk it. Put in my line so that way I got my hairline drawn in. And then I'm going to work out. If you're having trouble getting a clean line, add a little bit of water to your brush, and that should help. You don't want to add a lot because you don't want it to risk running up and down your canvas. And I'm going to go ahead and fill in my space for his different hair streaks where I drew my lines, because I'm going to go back in and add that detail in with gray, seeing as how he's kind of got a touch of it, and you'll see a little bit of it at like the nape of his neck. And the way they've got it, when they animated him, they added sort of like gray lines kind of right where I'm painting to sort of separate it. So we're going to do that too. And we can clean up our lines a little bit more when we put in his face. Because you know, I always like to save my face for last. I recently finished up a new Gertie make. I finished up the new Joan dress that they have on Patreon. I absolutely love it, and now I'm imagining a Joan dress in literally every single color of velvet. I was kind of bummed I didn't have enough time to make one themed for Winnie the Pooh or Winnie the Pooh Day. It would have had like a red bodice, and then it would have gone down to a yellow skirt, and it would have been gorgeous. Especially with it being, you know, him being a bear, it would have had that velvety texture that would have been really cute for reminiscent of doing like an animal Disney bound. Okay, and I'm gonna kind of just touch a little bit just to create a little bit of texture. I'm just dragging the brush around a little bit so that way the strokes are all kind of there. I'm gonna rinse off, and I'm going to take a little bit of my gray, and I'm going to use my smallest brush, and I'm going to do this little bit of gray he's got down here kind of mixed in. Kind of up and around the ear. And it kind of goes down to a point like that. I wanted the brown in first because I didn't want the gray to seem stark, because it kind of goes and blends in a little bit. And I'm going to go ahead and do a couple of quick little lines that are indicating kind of the directionality of the way his hair goes back from his head. Kind of like in the reference image. And boop, almost rested my hand down in there. It kind of goes from here down into the temple. And this one kind of comes to the apex of his hair down to the center. And this one kind of comes from up here. So we've kind of got the basis of our hair in. I'm going to rinse off. Nope. I'm not sure if chat's going on. It says reconnecting to chat, so I'm sorry if I don't see your chats for whatever reason. It's not showing. All right, and since I've got a little bit of the brown left on my palette, I'm going to go ahead and put in his eyebrow. This is the part where it would probably come in handy to dry my canvas, just because at this point there's not really a way for me to do this without resting my hand. So I'm going to go ahead and rinse off and dry my palette, or dry my painting. And that's good enough for me to work with. I'm going to go ahead and finish filling in his eyebrow without fear of my hand smearing green everywhere. There we go. And again, if you're having trouble getting a clean line, just add just a little bit of water to your brush. And for this one, his eyebrow kind of runs off the side. I was realizing the other day that all of my villains, as I've been choosing my reference image, they're all facing the same way. And I'm 3 in and they're all facing, to the right. So I'm wondering if I'll wind up flipping orientation now that I'll be one more and I'll be halfway through the set, because I've got red, orange, and yellow. Green will be the magic mirror. Blue will be Hades. I think I had set purple aside to be Oogie Boogie, or maybe it was something else. I think Oogie Boogie I had set through the background in pink, so I'm not sure. I'd have to look at my list. I don't remember offhand. If anyone in chat remembers what I said I'd be doing, feel free to pop that in there. Okay. So next I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put in my red. This is sort of a brown too, but it's a different shade of brown. So I'm going to do that after I do the red. And for the red, I'm going to go with Scarlet, because I kind of want a deep rusty red. And I'm going to actually switch over to my angle brush again. And I think I'll go ahead and lay out some quinacridone Scarlet as well, because I want to be able to differentiate between the two shades. But I'm going to only put a little bit on my palette. I don't want a whole lot on there at once. And because for this, I'm wanting to do the underside, it's easier to work upside down. So I'm going to flip my canvas. And I'm going to start with my deepest shade, that's my Scarlet, and do my lines. There is a method for why I'm doing it this way. I'm wanting to get my outline in, so that way when I do my shading, I wind up with the lightest colors closest to the middle. I am going to put a little more of my color in, kind of around the sides. My line got a little messed up there, so I'm going to just do a quick try and do a little course correct. Okay, and I'm going to rinse off. And now I'm going to switch over to my slightly lighter shade and put that in the center. We're just kind of telling the story of like the texture of this. So I definitely want to indicate that you know, there's the light is touching it a certain kind of way and there's creases. So we want our brush strokes to kind of follow along with that shape. Make sure that you continue it on the underside of your canvas. And then go ahead and rinse off. And since I'm already kind of working on the bottom here, I'm going to go ahead and fill in this. And for this, we're going to use burnt sienna because we want a shade of brown that has a little bit of red into it. They'll look sort of more like leather. You won't need a whole lot of this, so I don't recommend putting a whole lot on your palette. But if you wind up with a little too much, you'll be able to stick white in it because that's burnt sienna is kind of how we're going to make the skin. All right, and don't forget your undersides and your side. Okay, and continuing on the side. And I'm just going to make sure that all my brush strokes make sense, that they're all in the same direction. And I'm going to rinse off. Right, and I'm going to dry my canvas so that way I can flip it over without worrying about the colors up here smearing. And if you're not sure how to tell if canvas is wet, when you're looking at it from an angle, if it's shiny, then it's wet. Okay. Oh, and now that I've got it right side up, I can kind of see where I want to touch up my line a little bit. So I'm going to do that real quick with my little detail brush. Okay, and kind of same over on this side. I'm just going to touch up my line a little bit. Here we go. Okay, and then rinse. Now the next thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to start filling in his face, just because it is the bulk of the remaining color. And then I'll go back afterwards and then put in the dark brown for his mustache. I didn't want to do that at the outset just because I want to be able to do that with a clean line, and that's such a small area. So you're going to make his skin tone by putting burnt sienna and white together, mostly white, because the burnt sienna is very dark. You don't need a whole lot. Okay. Now I'm going to go ahead and mix it on my palette. And I actually need to add a little bit more because mine is a little lighter than I want. It's a little too light. We're kind of looking for like a cafe latte look here. This is pretty much the exact color that I mix my coffee to. Something kind of like this. Although, which reminds me, I brewed some ice wine tea, and I'm super excited about it. I get loose leaf tea, and I do the actual kettle. I love tea, big on my tea, and I had just gotten a new tumbler, which meant that it would actually stay hot for the duration of a painting session, because normally tea for me gets too cold to drink after about 15 minutes, and I can't finish a hot beverage that quickly. It takes me a minute. I got this super cute Animal Crossing one that I'm in love with. Okay, now I'm gonna go ahead and start putting in his face. And I'm gonna try not to overly smear his lines for the direction on his face, just because I don't want to lose where they are to be able to add in my detail. So as soon as I go over it, I'm gonna want to actually put in that line there so it doesn't get lost. And you'll kind of want to paint in that same direction. So that your brush strokes make sense. So I'm going to go ahead and take a little bit of burnt sienna plain. And draw in the line back for his kind of forehead crease. So it's not lost. I'm going to wind up blending it out a little bit, but I didn't want the line to be totally lost in the shuffle. Because I already can't see where it was. But it went something like that. Okay. And now I'm going to continue on and filling in his face. And this is a good point where when you put in your background, if you're a little overzealous, you can clean up your lines a little bit. It happens to the best of us. And you can always make corrections on your lines if you do make a mistake. And I want to kind of blend out any of my brush strokes. I don't want them super visible because the face doesn't have that. But some of that will disappear when we add in more details. And then I'm going to go ahead and add in my lines so they don't get lost. He's got this little line here and a slightly longer one there. And this kind of eyebrow crease that went here. All right, and now I'm going to finish kind of this area. You know, I'm kind of surprised that, maybe not surprised, but I wish there was a ride for Tarzan, like kind of like the experience you get when you're playing Kingdom Hearts and you having to slide through the trees. Like, I think it'd be so awesome if there was like a ride kind of reflective of that part of the Kingdom Hearts game series. I think that would be so awesome. I know that, character meet and greets, they have to be limited and whatnot because of the licensing for Tarzan is a little unusual. And that's why there's not photo pass photographers for Tarzan or Jane or Turk when they're out, but it would still be awesome. And I'm going to continue putting this line here so it doesn't get lost. I'm going to go ahead and put that part of my line in too before I get down there. Because even if I paint over it, it'll add some shade to the area. And if at any point your lines are feeling like the area is too cramped for your brush, feel free to switch to a smaller brush. I probably will in a minute. In fact, yeah, I'm going to have to for that spot. There's a little just too much going on there. And I'm going to go ahead and fill that spot in with this tiny brush. Just because at that point, that is easier than fighting with the angle brush. And I'm going to put my line back in so it's not lost. And I'm going to kind of put it in here too. I'm going to keep using the small brush for over here, because I think that will help me maintain a little better control in that area around the eye. There we go. So you see, even though I'm kind of painting over where I drew that line, it's adding a little bit of shadow to where the line, I'm going to put it back in. But I do want to make sure that I'm not creating like excessive brush strokes. On that note, I think I'm ready to switch back over to the other brush. And a little more. By treating the areas that are different parts of the face as separate zones, you'll wind up using brush strokes that will kind of lend itself around the shape, allowing for like the idea of the movement of the shape and the texture of your face and the way it kind of all centralizes around something. And now that I'm done there, I'm going to go ahead and put my line back in. And he's kind of got an aggressive under eye mark there that comes up like that. And I'm going to go ahead and put in the part for his nose so it doesn't get lost. And it's kind of got a little weird sneer. It's got a double line there. He's got a really pronounced nose. Have you ever noticed that all of the villains all have really pronounced noses? I'm not sure why, they just absolutely do. And we'll ultimately wind up like outlining his whole face with the burnt sienna. And we'll be doing a darker spot there. But for the moment, I'm going to switch back over. And we're going to start putting this in. And I'm intentionally following that line there. Because I'm kind of telling the story of the shape of his jaw. I'm going to switch back to my little brush. Because I don't want to lose the line, these defined lines around his nose. I'm going to add shading, shading and details in after I get my initial color layout in, but I don't want to lose it. It would just be so much harder to add back. But do try to flatten out your brush and minimize excessive brush strokes. There we go. Is anyone doing anything fun this weekend? I know it's only Wednesday, but I know I'm already thinking about the weekend. I have a new truck coming in, or supposed to be coming in. I pre-ordered it back in October, so that way it'd be easier for me to load up my vehicle from markets. All my tables, my tents, and all of my paintings. I currently do it in a little 4-door sedan, and it is definitely not easy. I have to permanently remove my back seat to get all of my stuff to fit in my car. It works, but it is not a pleasant time for anybody. And the load up at the end of the night is ridiculously difficult. There we go. Here we go. Right, and we definitely don't want to lose the line for the mustache, because he's got a heck of a wicked looking mustache. If I'm able to, get it up there early and get going, I'm gonna go to a princess tee. And I've been working on fixing this thrift store dress that I bought, and it's like looks like an 80s prom dress. I've never heard of Zoom Zoom as a dress brand before, but I did a Google Lens search on it, and I just couldn't find anything that looked anything even remotely like this dress. So I'm gonna guess it's a little old. It's definitely dated, and the zipper was broken on it, and it was a little snug, and someone had made an alteration to the straps that doesn't really quite work. So I added a corset back to it today. I finished that part, but I still need to finish all the remainder of the corrections. I'm going to add a halter sleeve to it and remove the weird straps that they attached. And I might do a couple of other things to it. It's got a crinoline built into it, but I think I want to embellish the crinoline because it is such a really pretty dress, and you can see kind of on my Instagram story what that project is, and I'll be doing updates on that. Okay. And I'm going to kind of outline his nose and the kind of curl of the lip there. So that way, when I put in the rest of the flesh tone here, that little, that the shadow of his nose is still there and not lost, putting in this part of his cheek that's sort of kind of hidden from view. I think he's got the most menacing teeth of any of the Disney villains, though, having now drawn and painted several of them. I think his teeth are definitely the most scary. I don't want to lose this bit of the sneer, so I'm going to go ahead and paint in that part of my line so it doesn't get lost. And the side of his cheek, I want that there too. And then I'll go ahead and fill in the rest of the flesh tone. Get the extracts off my brush real fast. And we're going to finish this little spot, and then we'll finish outlining his mouth. I'm just trying to clean up my brush strokes a little bit, so when I do my second layer, what I'm working on will make the most sense. All right, I'm going to flip it because I keep wanting to get my wrist down in what I'm trying to work on. Might be time for another quick dry. There we go. Okay. And I'm also going to do his little ear over here. Oop. At some point I picked up paint and I picked it up there. So I'm just going to add a little bit of water, smooth it out. Most of that won't show up later, but it's definitely a cautionary tale for making sure your canvas is dry before you rest your hand in it. All right, and now I'm going to go ahead and fill back in using my angle brush now. Just because now I'm getting ready to work in a bigger space. There we go. And brush stroke does matter. You definitely want to make sure that you're always following the line that you're filling in, because otherwise you will wind up with something that looks more like Pablo Picasso. And while this is going to be sort of a unique take by the time we add in all of our lines and our dots and all of our texture, we don't want it to look like a jigsaw puzzle. We do want it to make sense. And I'm going to put my jawline back because it kind of, as I was working, it kind of got lost. There. And we kind of want, when we're filling this area, and we'll want to add a little bit of extra burnt sienna because this part should be darker just a little bit, and then down here should be considerably darker because that's where his neck is. And if you're thinking about the way the light would hit it, it would be in shadow. Right, now I'm going to turn it back right side up. And I'm going to paint along the line for his jaw. And I'm going to make sure I kind of tell the story of the angle here. Okay, I'm going to switch back to my detailed brush so that way I can do the inside of his ear. Being careful to not rest my wrist inside his face, because all that paint is still wet. And trying to keep it from being too overly done in brush strokes, but I think I'm going to wind up having to just do another layer after the fact to get that corrected. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and outline the jaw in the burnt sienna. And I'm wanting this line to be kind of blurred and thick. I want it to sort of fade into his skin because I want it to kind of tell the story of that's where the chin ends and that's where the neck begins. And I'm going to flip it again because now it's getting a little hard to get the angle I'm wanting to work at. And I do need my paint still wet to do what I'm doing. You can kind of see I'm kind of trying to blend in the edges of where I'm working into it. So that way it's kind of telling the idea of that there's the light is not like directly there. It's more smooth, more gradual. And we're going to do a little bit of that over here too. If you weren't doing makeup, you'd call this contouring. Where contouring is chin to intentionally make it look more big. Okay. And now we're going to start working on his chin. And we're going to add a little bit of burnt sienna to our existing skin palette. Actually, before we do that, we should probably go ahead and finish like doing any touch-up work that we want to do here where you could see your brush strokes a lot because it's kind of transparent. So we're going to fix that real quick before we add any more burnt sienna, because then it'll be a lot more noticeable when we go to add this layer in, and we'll make him unintentionally more swarthy than he deserves. We don't want that. We don't want to make him look suave or debonair. He should just be devilish. Okay. And just just a quick touch up. We're not spending a whole amount of time here. We're just kind of doing a quick cover up of some small areas where there were a lot of excessive brush strokes because it was a thin area and I was using this brush and it made a lot more impression than I wanted. So adding another layer here will help kind of cover that up. Texture is all well and good on your face, but you do want to make sure that it doesn't look like crumbled paper. There's definitely good and bad ideas of texture for depending on what area of the body you're working on. Paper-like thing might be great for Yzma, being that her whole thing is that she's old. Maybe same with Ursula, or if you were doing like the Hag Witch, but he's not quite that old. Not old enough for the idea of paper-like skin. If I was to hazard a guess, I'd probably say Clayton was probably in his mid-40s, but I actually haven't, before now, had never thought too much about his age. So I guess I'd have to Google it to figure it out. If I remember, or if anyone pulls it up and puts it in chat, that would be fun. I'm curious how old Clayton is. There we go. Okay. And I think that's pretty good for the touch-up. I think we're ready to go ahead and add our burnt sienna in now. It didn't occur to me before, but he actually kind of reminds me of the villain from The Rescuers Down Under as well. I don't remember his name, but he has like even the same kind of color and adventure-y outfit. I am going to go ahead and do the outline of the burnt umber, though, of the rest of his face before I forget. He's looking kind of dastardly. I'm going to put his, sharpen back up his lines for his face. Get all of those details in there. Oop. There we go. And the other eyebrow crease. Might have to recommend Clayton some moisturizer. I'm thinking he's got kind of a skincare issue. He's definitely got a lot going on in the facial department. Then we're going to finish adding in this line. And we're just touching up our lines so that way when we add in the rest of our burnt sienna to our skincare palette or skin tone palette, that the lines don't get messed up. There we go. And I'm gonna go around his ear here. And telling the story of his little ear canal there. His ears are little because he talks too much. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and outline the top of his mouth. Trying really hard not to get my wrist in here, but if you're not able to do this, anytime you gotta stop and dry your canvas, that's good. Always better to be safe than sorry. And we're just kind of touching up the outline of his nose. Getting at that sharp impact. There we go. And the bottom of his mouth. If at any point you're having a hard time getting a clean line, add a little bit of water to your brush. Don't worry if you make any mistakes, you can always go over them. All right, I'm going to go ahead and outline his eye as well, because his eye is part of like the depth of his skin. But I don't need to do the whole eye because part of that story is already told by the eyebrow and his nose. So I'm just going to do here on that eye and his eyelid. And then on this side, we don't have to do the upper part, but we do have to do all the rest of it. And the eyelid. Oop. All right, and now we're going to go around his chin. And on the bottom. Again, don't worry about small details. We are going to cover all of this again with additional lines. So there is going to be a lot more texture and colors presented. You know, unless you choose you want to stop at the end of the basic putting in of the painting. Meaning you can do that. You don't have to go all the way. I just always paint all my villains in the same style with a lot of fun dotting technique. All right, so we've got all of the line work done for his face. Now we're going to add in the skincare here, the skin color, and it does have to be a little darker than what we used for his face. It has to be representative that it's, you know, the sun is hitting here more and then it's not hitting here as much. So you add a little more of your burnt sienna to the color that you already have mixed for his skin. And it should be a little bit darker. Not to be a lot darker. He's still, you know, yes, he's an explorer. He's out exploring and, you know, in the jungle, but he is still a Victorian dude at this point. and they were kind of fussy about their skincare. And you want to minimize your brush strokes as much as possible. You want to make sure that the lines that your brushes is making make sense. And at some point you'll want to switch over to a detail brush just because this is going to get a little bit close to everything else that's already going on. And that's fine. I'm going to try and get as close as I can without that though. Okay. And now I'm going to add in some burnt sienna to outline the story of his neck. And because I'm having a difficult time not getting my hand in here, I'm going to go ahead and dry my canvas a little bit. And at this point, it might be easier for me a little bit to turn this sideways. And just so it doesn't get lost, I'm going to draw in the line for where my little necklines are. Okay. I'm going to use my little brush to kind of fill in more over here. I can't get as close as I would like without creating a bit of a mess. And I'm going to go ahead and put another quick little smushy layer over this. It's not to be perfect, but I want some kind of texture there. Okay. Get up in this corner. And now I'm going to go ahead and start moving around the other side of his underside of his neck. Okay. And we're still just kind of filling in his neck. It's kind of cathartic. It's sort of like coloring, but it's just paint. There we go. And again, the directionality, you want to kind of keep that in mind when you're placing your brush strokes, because you don't want to make it look like he's got a whole lot of like weird lines on his neck. I mean, I guess unless you were doing what he would look like post hanging from a vine, but I think that's a bit morbid. But if that's what you want to do, who am I to stop you? You do you. All about your own artistic vision here. Or if you wanted to do something really fun and do all of them as like zombies, or what they'd look like if they had like the measles, or whatever. That could be its own little fun take on the villains. I'm gonna add my line back. It got a little bit smeared there. And same over here. Just gonna touch up my line a little. And then over here, and then we've got the base layer of his face in. And then we'll put in the rest of the remaining colors. We'll let it dry, and then we'll go ahead and start our actual second coat with all of the additional details in there. We've just been color blocking at this point. Putting in the foundation. No pun intended. Okay. Now, we're going to go ahead and put in his mustache at this point. And we're going to use our burnt umber for that, if you still have any on your palette. And I lost a little bit of his line for his nose there, so I'm just going to put it back in. There. And I'm going to add a little water to my brush, just a little dot. There we go. Very nice. And I'm going to darken it up a little bit. It got a little diluted with my water. Okay. Let's match up the line. That one got a little bit thicker, so we need to match a little bit. There, that's better. Okay. And his gum line up here is kind of pink. So I'm going to take a little bit of white into some of the red I had left over from doing his ascot to make that shade. Because it's just a little bit that we need. We don't need a whole lot there. We're just kind of saying that that's the inside of his mouth. That's the gum line. Or that back tooth. And I'm going to clean up the line for his mouth here a little bit. Where it got away from me a little. May have to do that in a layer. Because white is kind of thin. It may not do all of what I needed to do on the first go. Okay. And the outline of his teeth is actually showing in gray on my reference. So I'm going to go ahead and outline his teeth in gray. And I'm going to make sure I've got water on my brush so that way the line is super smooth. Here we go. And continuing to fill in his teeth. All right, I may go back and add another layer there later. But for now, it's color blocked in. And a little bit of black. We're going to use literally so little. I'm just going to use the inside of my cap. And then on the other side. Okay. And the bit that they used for his eye flap, it sort of looks like it would be sort of have a little bit of like blue or something cool mixed in there with it. So I'm going to take a little bit of his skin tone shade and add just a tiny bit of gray in there to try and get that, tell the story of that weird shade that they're describing as sort of for his eyelid. Something that is not quite the same as the rest of his skin, not warm. Ooh, I got a little too much on my brush. It's just a very small area. You can see I just added just that tiniest bit of gray in there, so it kind of looks like he's tired. And while I'm in here, I think that is ready for another quick layer of white. It's going to take a little bit to clean up around the tooth line for me. All right, so we've got our base layer in. Now we're going to go add all of our second layer and all of our details. I'm going to dry my canvas. And because I kind of wanted to get more of that yellow into my background, I'm going to do that first while I still have a little bit of that yellow on my palette. And just go directly over top of my existing paint. You see how you can still kind of see the color that's underneath? That's what I mean when I say that yellow is a super opaque color. We don't want to get rid of all of the green that's showing because we still want that there, but we definitely want more yellow. Although I think I got a little more green out than I intended. Put some of that back in. We're just putting in more of the yellow in our background because I want to tell more of a story with that yellow. Because it fits in with the theming of what I'm wanting to do with my villain set. If you like yours more green, you know, absolutely feel free to do you. You don't have to do what I'm doing exactly. It's just kind of the story that I'm wanting to tell. And I need to get over here a little closer. And a little on the sides. Just kind of really getting that yellow in there. And across the top too. You can see it has more of that yellow green going on in with it. And I'm going to use my detail brush, my one round, to add a little more gray back into his hair. We're going to start telling a little more story about his hair. We're going to make that more noticeable. We preserved the line in our first layer, but it always gets a little bit drawn out. And then this thicker piece down here at his neck. There we go. Very good. Very good. Okay. And we're going to add a little more texture to the parts of his hair that are not gray. Remember we did that in burnt umber. So we're going to make portions of it look a little darker by adding a couple of simple strokes to smooth the extra paint. We're not going to do a complete layer. We are just kind of dashing it in. Little small thin lines. And where those lines are will naturally make the portions of the underpaint appear darker. And this is a good time to clean up any lines that you didn't like along the hairline here for a cleaner line if you need to. And we're just, like I said, putting a few simple lines kind of in the general direction of the way the hair is coming out of his head. And I'm going to do a cleanup of my line. All along the skin. And the bit where it comes up against your background too, if you need to. If you don't, good for you. Not, it's okay. Happens. All right, so we're kind of done with the burnt umber for now. Actually, no, we'll go ahead and put the next layer of his eyebrows in. We want them really dark. We really want them to look almost black, except for if you were right on top of it. There we go. Okay, and yeah, why not? We'll do his nose too. The mustache. We'll give it a second layer. It's a good opportunity to paint out any excess lines so that it appears super thick and villainous. This is a menacing mustache, guys. We're talking full-on Betty Boop villain here. There. We're going to go ahead and rinse off our brush. And I don't really feel like I need to do any cleanup of lines on his face. I feel like we did a good job of doing shading and toning there. So I'm going to do another quick layer of white in a couple of areas where I wanted to clean up the lines around the mouth. You'll always find that it's always a pain when you have to clean up around white. Because it is just very thin paint. All right, now we're going to talk about the kind of the texture of this leather kind of piece over here. So I'm going to turn my canvas upside down because it's easier to work with at the moment. So that way I don't put my hands down in all of this that I've just finished. And I still have this darker shade on my palette, so I'm going to do a quick little layer here. Just towards the ends. We're just kind of telling the story of the center and the folds and whatnot of this cravat. So I'm going to do across the top here, and then a few like flicks down, but not all the way. And the same over here. We're going to do across the top. Let it have another good little layer there so it's nice and deep and rich in color. Same along the sides. And don't neglect your undersides. And I'm going to do a few like flicks from the top. And then I'm going to go back in with my quinacridone scarlet and do a layer there. And then blend it up towards the ones that I flicked. And not neglecting my underside. And again, blending it up towards the top. All right, so we've kind of deepened that shade a little bit. We're giving it a little bit more vibrancy. And while I've got that kind of color there, I'm going to add a little thin little layer of a very watered down version of the same color over where I did the pink for the inside of his mouth. Right, we did this in a burnt sienna, the same as the outline of his face. So we're going to kind of add a little more there. And we're going to do this in little lines. We're just going to dash it, just little dashes. Where it covers up in the next layer will ultimately wind up being darker than the previous layer. And this is what we want. We're just kind of creating a little bit of drama about this piece. And don't neglect your sides. Now we're actually also going to use a little bit of our yellow ochre. And we're going to tell a little bit about the story of this yellow. We used cadmium deep hue to get the background of it in, but it needs a little bit of shading. So we're going to outline it with the yellow ochre, being very careful to not stick our hands down in the middle of all of the hard work we've just done. And making sure not to neglect our sides. And I'm going to turn it around again, because now I need the other side. Whoop. And we're just kind of telling the story of this jacket, this shirt. And we have a seam here. And we have this shoulders thing going on here. And now that we have that in, we're going to use the same shade to add little strokes. Just little dashes. We're just creating some fun little texture. You know, at this point, you could call your painting done before adding any of this. You could call yourself done if you really wanted, but I like a lot of fun texture in my paintings. I like a lot of drama. Not my personal life. Stay out of my personal life with drama, but I love it in my art. And there's not any rhyme or reason attached to the way in which I'm putting these in, really, other than I'm following the line that's there for the shoulder seam. But I definitely don't want it to look like an intentional repetitive texture. And don't neglect your sides. And I'm going to flip my canvas. So that way I can do the underside. And I'm going to do over here as well. Just creating some fun little texture, some little drama. And don't forget over here. And I kind of like the idea of maybe using the yellow ochre on his face as well. So I'm going to experiment in a spot with it and see how I feel about it. And I'm thinking about for his neck. So we have to make sure it gets, oh yeah, I like that. We'll use it. We're going to use some of the yellow ochre on his neck. We're going to bring some of that in because I think that works nicely there. We're not going to overdo it. We don't need to, we're just telling a little bit about maybe the idea of the light refracting off of his shirt a little bit onto his skin. Right, and I'm going to flip back over. And make sure that all my lines kind of follow this jaw. Again, we're not really overdoing it. We're just putting a little here and there. And still just following and filling it in. There we go. At this point, most of it's kind of repetitive, putting it in the lines. But the repetitive techniques is what makes it look pretty awesome at the end of everything. It's a lot of work and it's very monotonous, but the payoff is amazing. Okay, so we've gotten that first little layer of dot in there. I'm going to go back in with my quinacridone scarlet, and I'm going to do a couple of dots in there too. Or not dots, at this point I'm doing lines. Just throwing it in. Even in areas where it's already there, it'll just make it look darker and add some fun texture to what's already there. And same with the scarlet. We're just going to put it right on top. Of what's already there. Just creating a little bit of movement. And we'll use a little bit of that Scarlet Raw. Make a few lines in his mouth. And now I'm going to take my yellow ochre and I am going to do long flat lines in the background. Your paint can be thick here, it doesn't matter. We're just kind of outlining the idea of where some like bamboo trees might be if they were kind of blurred out into the distance, into our background. Don't neglect your tops and sides. And we'll add more in there later. We're nowhere near done. We're in for a long sit. Alright, now we're going to add some more of our skin tone lines in. In the areas where we did it a little bit darker, you'll want to add some that are a little lighter and vice versa. We're just creating variations of shade. And if you get a clump like I just did, just pick it up and you're fine. You can always add another little quick little bit at the end if you feel like you had a glob that you didn't like. And it's okay if your lines cover up some of the yellow you just put on. This is about layering. We're not trying to get it to be completely, you know, hit a new fresh spot every time. It's about repetition and building the layer of the story. There we go. I started planning out a spring capsule wardrobe for all the different ways to use all of the charm patterns that I have. Kind of excited about it. Now that I've started planning a little bit of my outfits for Diagnosis Day, I'm really like into it. It's going to be so awesome. She has such an extensive pattern collection, and so many of them have so many different purposes. I kind of want to redo the Joan and use like the bit for the long sleeves from the Barbie top to kind of create a long sleeve version that would be perfect for when it's colder. All right, now I'm going to add a little bit of white into my dashes and lines for my skin. I guess we're about 4 layers deep on our skin, but being that for him, this is the majority of his face, there's not as much, the majority of this painting isn't about, you know, his clothes or his background or anything like that. A lot of it is his face just because of the way his face is shaped. There's a lot going on there. So we have to make sure we tell that story. of just how much real estate space this guy's face takes. There we go. I want you to keep my mom in your thoughts as she undergoes a pacemaker surgery this week. Lots of happy prayers and thoughts for that. A little bit of pixie dust our way, if you don't mind. I don't care. Any happy vibes or prayers, thoughts, whatever, however you put goodwill out into the universe. Everybody's different and has their own way of doing things and wishing luck and all that. So whatever way you would wish luck, could use a little bit of it just to make sure it all goes well. And we're almost done with his face. And then we'll go back to telling the story of his hair, because we're not done with his hair. We're nowhere done with his hair. In fact, I think I'm gonna mock him a tiny bit, and we might use some silver in there. I think we're gonna tell a story with some silver. We're gonna make this guy feel old. I think he deserves it. All right, so we've got his face in. I'm gonna grab some of my metallic silver. I'm gonna poke some fun at him. Because it just tickles me pink to do that. I think he can stand the mocking. Definitely be careful of your canvas, because it should be quite wet. And you'll want to stick that metallic silver directly over where you put the gray. And you should see it. Like, it should be quite immediate when it's hitting light that this is shiny. This is intentional. This man is middle-aged. He is, in fact, a dirtbag. It reminds me of this time when my mom and we went to Dollywood, and I think she was either in her 40s or 50s. I'm not quite sure. But I was a mean little crap of a kid, not really meaning it to be particularly mean, but I definitely embarrassed her with strangers getting, waiting on the train. I'd say, "Mommy, your hair is shining and it's not the sun." With mean little kid, but it did shine. My mom's got very shiny hair, but it is very pretty. Like, it's very luscious. She did not, like, she was by no means like a head full of gray. She had like a couple, and I was just a mean little kid of a cat, a mean little crap of a kid. There we go. All right, so we've got our silver and our silver streaks, and I am gonna add another little layer of like dashes of the dark, and I think I'm gonna take a little bit of this lighter bit from the skin and kind of work that in too. just to kind of tell the story of some light hitting his hair that isn't the shiny part. But because he's a bit of a douchebag, I think I am going to stick a couple of like a little bit of the silver dashes in there too, just because I'm a mean little shit and he's a mean little shit, and it's okay. My husband's back there laughing at me, but I'm okay with it. I'm allowed to admit that I'm a mean little shit. I'm a bit vindictive. There. I think that's cool. We grade him out a tiny bit, but you know what? It be that way. It be that way sometimes. It's art. It's dope. Okay. We're gonna go ahead and dry up because we need to do more layers, and I will absolutely smear the fuck out of this thing if I try to do another layer right now. It's not totally dry, but it will do enough for now. Just be very careful about how you're sliding your wrist or anything across what you're working on. I am going to add some lines of burnt sienna over here where I did, burnt umber over where I did my burnt sienna, because I want this to be a little darker still. So I'm just going to do some dashes there. Again, just kind of following the direction of the shoulder. And it's okay if you cover up lines you've already done. The idea here is to build layers of texture. And to that end, I'm going to go ahead and add a couple of some dark dashes in his hair. I want some of that silver I put in to shine through, but I do want, we're not telling the story of an old man. We're telling of a story of a douchebag. Yeah. And I think I'm ready to start adding some more of the detail into the background now too. Although I do think I'm going to finish up here first with the red ascot. I still have a ton of this red left on my palette, and we all know how I feel about excess paint on my palette. So I'm going to go ahead and add it in. In fact, you know what? I'm going to switch over to the dotting tool for this because I want it on there nice and thick. We want gobs of it. So I'm literally scooping it onto my metal tool here and setting it down. We did our dash work, we did our shade work, but now is where the details really happen. This is where it takes your piece being pretty to remarkable. This is where it happens. All of the extra detail, all of the extra layers, the thick layers. We want a lot of feeling attached to this. All right, and now that I've used up the last of my scarlet, I'm going to use up the last of my quinacridone magenta, or my quinacridone scarlet. And I'm going to make sure I stick it mostly in the center, where I want the highlight of that color to appear. And I am going to stick a couple in his mouth. Because why not? It's already there. It's on my canvas, or on my palette. And I need to get rid of the paint. All right, and I got rid of all the red. I still have white left, and I have a fair amount of it, so I'm actually going to work it into the yellow. I'm going to start with use a brush first, just because there is so much of it. Okay, and don't neglect your underside. Or your sides. And then we're going to do the over here on this bit. And then this horizontal bit. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to touch up some lines around the inside of his eye. And I think I'm going to use some of the white in my bamboo too. So I'm going to dry my canvas so that way the bottom part doesn't get all smeared. My rolling cart went right over my hair dryer. It's still a little wet, but it should be dry enough for me to work with now. So I'm going to go ahead and flip it. And I'm going to use my angle brush. Because I'm going to want a line, like lines here. And I'm just going to dip my white just barely in there. Because for this, instead of a ton of dots, I think we're going to go with just mostly lines. And if the color you have most on your palette left is skin tone or brown, anything really besides red, you could use that instead of white. I'm just kind of using what's left on my palette already. And don't neglect your sides. Or your top, you want to make sure you get everywhere. You don't want it super repetitive. You want it like all in the same row, all lined up. You definitely want it in, kind of variation. If you feel like you're accidentally creating a pattern, break up the pattern. Okay, now that I've got my white in there the way I want, I'm going to do the same thing, but with my cadmium yellow. And I might wind up covering spots I did with the white. I'm just kind of smattering it on there. And I need to put some more yellow on my palette. And it's okay if it winds up a little bit clumpy. That's kind of the look we're going for here. It does mean that your canvas will take longer to dry, just because the paint will be really thick. And don't forget your sides. All right, and I'm gonna rinse my brush. And I'm definitely done with the angle brush. I don't need that anymore for this. Anything left will be with my one round or my dotting tool. I'm going to use the one round to add a few more layers of some pretty like heavy on of the cadmium yellow over his shirt. We really want that to like feel raised when it dries. You should be able to feel the texture of the paint. That's the kind of feeling that we're going for here. It kind of reminds me of Velveeta, if I'm being entirely honest. Although I did not have Velveeta as a kid. That was some fancy BS I was introduced to when I was in my 20s. I was a Kraft mac and cheese kid where you had to have water in your dish for the dried cheese packet. Like that's what mac and cheese was. The idea of like this fancy Velveeta thing is just weird, and I messed it up royally the first time because I was like, you have to leave water in there, and I made soupy mac and cheese because you didn't have to add water for Velveeta, and that was a weird like life thing for me to discover in my 20s, learning to cook for the first time. All right, I'm pretty happy with that. I've got a lot of good rich texture. And I think I'm going to go ahead and add some of the yellow onto my brown bit here. And then I'll go back and add like some black dots, I think. And I still have a little bit of this yellow left, so I'm going to kind of stick it in a couple of places. So that way there's nothing left on my palette. Anywhere I think could use just that little bit of extra yellow texture. Right, and I'm going to rinse off. I've got some skin tone left, so I'm going to add it back over top of my lines with my dotting tool. And I'm just kind of adding it on there as another layer of texture, just because I've already got the paint made up and it will just go to waste if I don't use it, so why not? The goal is to always use everything on your palette. If you put it out, then commit to using it. I wouldn't say that Clayton is like a favorite villain of mine, but he is certainly like I said, a fun villain to hate. He's just so hate worthy. He's definitely not one of those ones where they'd ever be able to go back and tell like a misunderstood villain story. He's just a scumball of a human being. I love those Disney books where they go back and they tell like, why Ursula was bad, or, you know, filling in the blanks for Maleficent and whatnot. But there is no redeeming quality about Clayton. He's just literally villainous. I don't know that there's any redeeming quality about Lady Tremaine either, though. I did not paint her as a villain. She was not one of the ladies I did. There are a remarkable number of lady villains that wear red. Like, and I was already stretching my luck by doing two different ones that were red. I did the Evil Queen, and I had done Cruella. I absolutely had to do Cruella. She's a very popular villain, and there was no way I couldn't do the Evil Queen. She had to be done. She's just so quintessential. She's the first villain, the very first. Of course, she had to have her own portrait done. She's too important. If it wasn't for her and the success of Snow White, then we wouldn't have had any of the other villains. At least not as we know them today. They may have happened a different way, by a different artist, different studio, different story. The whole thing would be different. So, credit where credit is due. We're kind of wrapping ourselves up here. I'm just kind of using this last little bit of like skin tone paint that I've got on my palette, and I think that I might call myself done. I might have to mix up just a little more skin tone to finish. I hope not, but I'm prepared to do that if I must. Commit to idea, you have to finish the idea. There we go. And almost done. Okay. Oh, no, I still have all of the neck to go. Right, I'm gonna have to mix up a little more of my paint. Just a little, though. Okay. I'm just gonna put it in. Okay. And I think I'm just about ready to sign it. Actually, let me add some dimension to his eyeball real quick. There. Just a quick little dot. I'm going to take a step back and see how I feel about it. I'm still not totally in love with it. So I'm going to add a little bit of, I think, black to down here. And just because I'm going to use so little, I'm going to use the inside of the cap. Yeah, I like that a little better. And I think I want to add some dot work into the background. So I'm going to go ahead and dry my canvas. And I have a little bit of white left on my palette, so I'm going to use that to add a few little dots.